Hopefully we are broadcasting live. We've had busy working in the background with some technical difficulties, but we are there. And thank you so much for joining our webinar today, where we're talking about the skills puzzle, the lifetime guarantee, our lifetime skills guarantee, and everything around adult education. So my name is Jon Wilson. I'm the CEO for Totaljobs Group, and I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your busy days, which I know they are, for joining this webinar today. The Totaljobs Group have been working closely with the think tank, the Work Foundation, and we're working in partnership, studying the analysis of labour market data, qualitative insights from employers and experts in adult education, as well as candidate perspectives, and we're going to talk about that today. But firstly, I'm joined by Mel Wilkes, who is Head of Research for the Work Foundation. Mel, would you take a moment, introduce yourself?
Of course. Hi, thanks, John, and thanks so much for having us. So I'm Mel Wilkes. I'm Interim Head of Research at the Work Foundation, and as the name suggests, we're a think tank focused on improving work in the UK. And we are a department within Lancaster University Management School.
Great, thank you so much for that. Looking forward to it. And so essentially the webinar today, it's in 3 chunks. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about state of play. Mel then is going to talk you through some of the research. And then the interesting part, I would say, or the more interesting part, is when we get to the conversation at the end. So we'll be joined by the Director of Policy for the British Chambers of Commerce, that's James Martin. And we'll also be joined by the Global Head of Sourcing and Attraction at BT, which is Hyland. And they'll be on our panel later with myself and Mel, where we'll talk through some of the issues facing businesses today. If we can move to the next slide. So, like I mentioned, before we get into the data, I want to just take a moment and give you an indication of kind of the current market situation in terms of what we can see in the data and what we can see from the work that we've been doing. Hopefully, we are halfway through a second lockdown in England. Hopefully it's not longer than that. But we know that the UK labour market, it's altered drastically through the course of this pandemic. Now, the latest unemployment figures show that there's a slight rise in the 3 months to September. And we're also seeing some green shoots on the Totaljobs website as vacancies rise in some specific sectors of industry. So skilled trades and construction, manufacturing, logistics particularly, as well as health and social care are seeing some strong recovery. However, and it is a big however, there are about 4.8 million people that are in mid-career work, so between 25 and 49, and they're not eligible for redundancy pay, having only been with their businesses for less than 2 years. And actually of that group, 1.6 million are in routine or manual roles within vulnerable sectors. So, you know, with those real crises facing people, it can sometimes be a difficult time to think about long-term future solutions. But really that's what we need. Is most of you will know that this pandemic has accelerated business trends that already exist within our economy. And so future-proofing is needed now more than ever to make sure that we're not reacting to these crises, but that we have the robust processes in place to make sure that we can deal with them in the future. So with that, like training, reskilling, and upskilling, they're essential to boost career prospects and the wider economy actually in the months and years to come. So that takes us into kind of long-term skills shortages. We've done some work on this previously, along with the British Chambers of Commerce. And before the pandemic started, the UK were seeing incredibly high levels of unemployment, historically high levels of unemployment. Yet consistently, employers have been reporting skills shortages for years. And really all sectors have been affected by that, but particularly business services, construction, hotels and restaurants, manufacturing, retail, wholesale. So it's a significant problem already before the COVID impact. More recently, the quarterly recruitment outlook by Totaljobs and the British Chambers of Commerce showed that on average, 3/4 of businesses faced difficulty recruiting for skills before the pandemic. And this is across a whole slew of different roles. So then you have on top of what was already a problematic situation, the impact from COVID-19 and also the impact of our lovely friend Brexit. And so training budgets were among the first to get cut as we entered into the current COVID situation that we find ourselves in. And many businesses have had their hands forced when it comes to making those cuts. We see here the average cut being 15%, but that's expected to be more as we get into the first half of next year. And as businesses, I think we know how important learning and development is to aid growth, to aid recovery, but many are highlighting that they're not as agile as they need to be because of the shortfall in skills. So if that wasn't enough to deal with alongside the pandemic, our transition period following the Brexit vote is coming to an end. And we know that a significant number of businesses are finding it harder to recruit people with the right skills since the UK voted to leave the EU, sitting at around 43%. And for some businesses, Brexit had already impacted training budgets before the pandemic made things even more challenging. So it's not to say that the picture was perfect before we got here. And one of the things that's interesting to note is that 80% of the workforce that will be in the labour market in the year 2030, they're also in the labour market today. So developing existing talent, it becomes essential as we move forward. There is no way around that when you consider the majority of the workforce are already working today. So 1 in 2, almost half of businesses that we spoke to had to reduce training budgets this year, and they did so because of financial difficulties caused by the pandemic. At that time, of course, those funds are better spent elsewhere as part of reactionary messages. And we know that 40% of businesses are saying that these funds are necessary to future-proof their business against the pandemic. So it's not that businesses necessarily are saying that training is not important, but they're facing bigger challenges right now, and they have to make moves within the budgets to cope with that. And so this takes us on to skills development for the UK. And so it essentially puts more emphasis on government-funded training at a time when we're having to make cuts to face the pandemic. So it's coming at a good time. Businesses might not have the same access that they did to L&D. So I think the lifetime skills guarantee and what we're about to talk about today is very, very timely. So to better understand what UK workers already have access to, we had a look at some of the historical data, and we found that only a fifth of routine manual workers had access to training last year. And that rises slightly to about 31% when you talk about people that are in management positions. The key thing here is that 77% of that training focuses on the job that the person is doing today, all right? And a very small amount focuses on the jobs that they may be doing in the future. And clearly, when you know the previous stat about the workforce today and where it's going to be in 30 years, is teaching people to do what they're doing today is not going to solve our problems. So it may be enough to meet their current role, but it doesn't really help people navigate a changing market, certainly in the months to come, but also in the years to come. And ultimately, it just means that as employers, we miss out as well. So if we look to the future of lifelong learning, it's this missing piece that gives employers the necessary skill sets to help their businesses recover. Our concern, or significant concern, is that there are 1.4 million people who won't even be able to access the government's lifetime skills guarantee, even though they're employed in manual or routine roles, and they really, really could benefit from that training. So it gets worse that when you think about alongside the ineligibility of people who need it, the people who could utilize this training, they face systematic and situational barriers alongside it. So they can mean that people who could most benefit from training will miss out unless the policy changes as we go into next year. So we want to be able to rally the government to make sure businesses can access the skills that they need while people can get the support that they need to upskill or unlock career progression and higher salaries. There are things that we in businesses can do to support our staff and the UK workforce to level up their skills too, but I think before we get into that, we'll touch on that at the end. Time to pass over to Mel, who can maybe shed a little bit more light on the key research findings and particularly the barriers that could cause an impact to the take-up of that training. So Mel, over to you.
Great, thanks, Jon. As Jon's alluded to, we've been working in partnership with Totaljobs to deliver new research looking at access to training in the UK. So, and I'll talk a little bit in a second about how we went about that, what we found, and what we're recommending as a result. But I think just to start off with, I'll just introduce the report. So we've produced some analysis called Learning to Level Up, and that's really about recognising that, as Jon's just outlined, for too many people, there are just structural and situational barriers that prevent them from taking part in opportunities to develop new skills, to progress in their current career, or to transition into another sector. So the analysis that we produced for this project involved looking at some quantitative data. So we ran analysis of the labour force survey as well as the skills and employment survey from 2017, looking at a particular group of workers, people aged between 25 and 49. Alongside that, we conducted some qualitative research, engaging with employers and with subject experts in the kind of policy sphere to really get beneath the issues that we were coming across and to understand how employers were changing their behaviour in response to the pandemic. So getting into what we found then, I'll start first of all with an introduction to the kind of training landscape as it stands. There's two key schemes that I think we should have at the front of our minds, one of which I imagine many of you are very familiar with now, Kickstart, which funds placements for young people who are receiving welfare benefits, particularly universal credit, and the Lifetime Skills Guarantee is a real focus of ours through this project. It offers free access to further education at level 3 for people that don't currently hold a qualification at that level. Now, delving a little bit further into that, if we could have the next slide. The reason we wanted to focus on the Lifetime Skills Guarantee is it offers a huge amount of potential for learners because it's offering, as I mentioned, kind of free training. This is to people who don't hold a qualification at A level or equivalent. So it could really unlock kind of new opportunities for learning and development. But through our analysis of the labour force survey, we found that there are 1.4 million people who could benefit from the scheme but aren't currently eligible for support. And alongside that, there's a wider group of people, as Jon's referred to, who could benefit from the programme, could benefit from access to training, but face a range of barriers, which I'll talk through briefly now, including confidence, personal commitments, and restrictions related to the welfare benefit system. So getting into those barriers, first of all, we've alongside those points about eligibility, we found that there were 7.5 million workers who haven't received any training since leaving full-time education. And the stakeholders that and employers that we spoke to told us that for a lot of people, negative experience of training or education can mean that it's really difficult to go back and re-engage later on. And that lower levels of literacy, numeracy, or digital skills have huge stigma associated with them, which can make it really hard for some workers to approach a training provider or look into learning opportunities because of really low confidence levels, which I'll talk about in a second. But that's a huge group of people who could benefit from training, but just feel perhaps quite distant from the adult education system. So if we could have the next slide, I'll just talk a bit more about that, that point about confidence in particular. Time and again, we heard from both employers and policy stakeholders that confidence is absolutely key, and that related both to confidence in someone's own abilities, as I mentioned, in terms of numeracy and literacy skills, but also a belief and perception that training is worthwhile. For many, there was a sense that training involves a huge commitment, both in terms of time, in terms of potentially working hours lost through attending training courses. So that personal investment needs to deliver a payoff. And for lots of people, there seems to be a perception that training won't unlock those opportunities for progression, better responsibilities, or higher pay. Alongside that, we found that another barrier, if we could have the next slide, sorry, another crucial barrier is eligibility. So Jon's touched on this slightly in terms of eligibility for the lifetime skills guarantee, but alongside that, there's rigidities within the welfare benefits system that mean that people who are on very low incomes and are struggling to get by aren't able to spend more than a very small amount of time each week engaging in training or skills development. So if people are getting benefits, whether it's like job seeker allowance or income support, then there are restrictions that mean that they can't take part in training for more than 16 hours a week. And for people who are getting universal credit and are in a particular requirements group, which means that they're required to demonstrate to their work coach that they're preparing for work and looking for work. They've got to be available, to spend 35 hours a week actively job seeking, which just is prohibitive. It just makes it completely impossible to engage in training in a meaningful way. And that lack of flexibility is really locking some people out of opportunities to train and develop, which is really important to think about at this point in time, because we know that the universal credit caseload skyrocketed earlier this year when the pandemic first hit, and caseloads are continuing to rise steadily. So this is something we'd really like to see government focus on over the months ahead. Finally then, I'd like to just touch on family commitments. I mentioned that we're talking about people who are at the middle of their working lives. And so, of course, many workers at this stage might have responsibilities as a parent or a carer, which just make it really difficult to then take on additional commitments involving training. One of the employers that we spoke to had talked about workers who had initially started a training course but were going in the evenings, and because the work that they were doing was very physical, manual labour, they were just exhausted juggling their work, their training and family commitments, and the kind of physical fatigue was really difficult to manage. Alongside that, of course, there's financial commitments. So people within this age group are more likely to have a greater degree of kind of financial responsibilities, whether that's a mortgage or the kind of financial responsibilities that come alongside caring for dependent family members. So there's some statistics on the slide here that set that out. We modelled this within the labour force survey and found that there are 1.9 million people who would have a child under the age of 16. And looking at the skills and employment survey, workers within that group are much more likely to report that they find it harder to access training opportunities. So these wider barriers, as well as the kind of restrictions in eligibility, clearly play a really key role in preventing people from taking part in training and building new skills. So thinking then about what that means, we'd like to see action at a kind of policy level, as well as, and we've also developed some kind of practical steps that we can all think about taking as employers too. So I'll just briefly outline the actions that we're recommending that policymakers take, some of which I've started to allude to already. Crucially, top of the list is about reviewing eligibility for the lifetime skills guarantee, which for the reasons that both Jon and I have outlined, should be about maximising access and participation for workers who are on low pay, regardless of the training that they already hold. Somebody might hold a level 3 qualification, whether it's an A-level or another training course, but that qualification may no longer be relevant to the world of work today, and it might not be it might not have given them skills that will allow them to progress or take on new responsibilities. So we'd like to see that package of support widened to workers on low pay. Alongside that, building on the points that I just made, particularly about family commitments, we'd like to see government offer support with indirect costs of taking part in training, particularly to workers on low incomes. Chiefly they're thinking about childcare costs, but other costs too, like travelling to take part in training once that becomes the norm again. And then building on that point I mentioned about the welfare benefits system, from our perspective, it would be a common sense measure to remove those restrictions on engaging in training for people who are receiving welfare benefits like job seekers allowance and universal credit. Thinking then alongside that, we'd like to see at a regional and local level engagement between providers of training, including colleges, local and regional government, as well as local enterprise partnerships and employers, so that opportunities for training are better aligned with local demand for skills. And alongside that, or through that process, we'd like to see some support for employers to navigate the adult education landscape. We heard through our research that many employers found the skills landscape very difficult to kind of engage and get into. It's very complex. It's hard to know exactly what's out there and what's right for their business. And one person in fact used the word overwhelming to describe the range of opportunities available. We'd like to see better support to navigate the system, and crucially that should be tapped in at a local level. And mirroring that point about the indirect costs of training to workers, we'd also like to see support to employers to meet those indirect training costs, like building on the points that Jon mentioned earlier. We know that there are lots of employers who really do see the value of investing in training, but have spent months firefighting now, which has meant that their training budgets are being eaten into. Government could support to mitigate some of that by offering support in covering staff while others are out training, or offering other forms of training incentives. So those are our recommendations for government. We've also developed a suite of recommendations for employers, which Jon will talk through with you now. Thanks.
Great. Thanks for that, Mel. I don't know if anybody's listening to this and just find it crazy that someone who's not working today has a limit on the amount of training that they can do, or someone that has an A-level 20 years ago is suddenly overqualified for some of this training. I think when you realize that the stat still blows me away, that 80% of the people in work today will make up the workforce in 2030, and most of our training is focused on what someone is doing today, and we know that the economy is accelerating. So thinking about UK PLC, I think it's vital that the government make those changes to not only help people now today, but also help our own economy grow over the next 10 years. So listen, I guess there's a lot that's happening already, and there's a lot that businesses are doing. So we try to crystallize some of that with advice, and then we'll get to talk about how that's happening in reality in a second when we get onto our panel discussion. So essentially, it's understanding the value of long-term investment in learning. So some of the pieces of advice that we think are important are, one, really just highlight the opportunities that are offered to the government, and we know how complex that is. So really it's about supporting staff to understand what's relevant for them. I think some people are unsure what their skill set today looks like, and then what skills they need for other roles that might be relevant for them. So I think it means it's overwhelming when you have a range of courses available without good information about helping someone understand how they take that next step. And obviously we talked about the way training is perceived sometimes within business, and that's critical for us to look at how it's positioned. And it shouldn't just be a refresher on how you do your job better, but positioned as what can you learn, what can you gain through getting new skills, and then make it clear as to like what's in it for them, and why we as business leaders, that we're happy for them to not work for a period of time whilst they go learn new skills. I think those things are crucial to making sure that what we currently have is working really, really well. And then I guess there are people within our organizations that are excellent at this, but it's looking at those workplace mentors who can help our teams and our people break down those training options and better understand the career paths that are available to them. And then flexibility, like we know for sure that in the last 8 months, we have all become like the most flexible businesses in the world. And this speaks to training as well. And so we'll look at tailoring the approach, and, you know, our teams more likely to be able to take part if it's a group session or it's something perhaps that works better on their own, and thinking about how do we make it accessible for all people. And like we mentioned before, is that consciousness of the responsibility outside of work, I think, is a fundamental challenge on helping people develop, particularly parents and carers with young children. So I guess to kind of counterbalance that and to make sure that actually we do develop those skills is really considering, you know, does paid study leave work for what you do? Or what may solve that even better is like, actually, can the training take place during work hours so that actually, one, it doesn't conflict with outside work responsibilities, but also means people are being paid while they learn. And then finally, I guess we think about transferable skills, and I would say, look, interrogate the existing programs that you already have. And if you're thinking about your L&D strategy and thinking about what's already there, is it taking into account the shift in the market demand? Is it taking into account the changing roles, the different ways of working, the different remits that our teams have? And then really consider how those transferable skills, they're relevant across teams in your organization, that can allow for greater flexibility across departments. And I think that's really important, is if you know the skills it requires to do job A and job B, and we know that 60% overlap, then it means that there are more progression paths within your own organization for people, and it really makes moves easier. Those transferable skills can also actually enable moves across industries as well. Within the Totaljobs group, we have a business called Caterer that recruits predominantly for the hospitality industry, which, as we all know, is one of those industries that's suffering the most in the current pandemic. So to help those job seekers, we help them understand that the skills that they had for the role they were in, and then help them see what other roles were available, particularly in care and logistics, for instance, that were really booming, and help to transfer people from one industry to another using their skills as a match. So we know it's possible. And as we move through this recovery period, don't forget about soft skills, things like flexibility, adaptability, resilience. They continue to be valued, as well as some of the more technical skills that we might invest our time and training on. So we're about to get into the panel discussion, and I guess quick sum up, the research says that funding alone won't give people the training that they need to unlock higher salaries and to be able to move industries. And I think we need to adapt the support that is on offer. There is a ton of barriers to access, and we can tackle those, and then we can see those benefits impact a wider range of people and a wider group of employers. I think it's important to note that some workers face wider structural inequalities in society, and training isn't really going to solve for those. Whilst it can present like a valuable route out of insecure work, it's not the silver bullet. And I think we as businesses should consider that part of a broader strategy to try and tackle some of those barriers to progression or barriers to entry. And obviously, as we've spoken recently, we are calling on the government to make the necessary changes. It's important that something that is exciting, that is interesting, that can help people develop, is actually getting to the people who need it and not being bound up in red tape. So with that, we get to the best bit. So we're onto our panel. If I can get a brief introduction from everybody. Mel, we've already heard from yourself. James, would you mind, if you can, unmute your camera and maybe pop on and introduce yourself, if you wouldn't mind.
Fantastic. Thank you, John, and thank you, Mel. That was absolutely fascinating, and I've never heard a more compelling argument for unlocking some government action that makes sense now and in the medium term. Having said that, I'm James Martin. I am the Director of Policy at the British Chambers of Commerce, and we work with John and his team across a range of initiatives, and skills and training is one of our absolutely key areas, probably just below Brexit and coronavirus at this stage, but
yeah, sure.
That's over the last 6 months.
Great, thanks, James. Vicky, I know you were having some technical difficulties before we started, so I don't know if we've got you by video or just by telephone, but if you're there, fingers crossed, would you mind introducing yourself?
Of course, and unfortunately I still can't get in, so hopefully you can hear me okay? We
can hear you loud and clear.
Fantastic. So it is a bit of a shame because I put makeup on for the first time since I did my last session with you. But hi, I'm Victoria Hyland. I'm Global Head of Sourcing and Attraction. So my team and I are responsible for the ways that we kind of attract and engage candidates to BP, and obviously Great. Skills is a key piece for us going forward.
Brilliant. Listen, thank you for that. And we talk about flexibility earlier, and you know, some of those immortal words. I can't see your video, and can you see my screen? They happen all of the time, so I'm sure we can roll with it. So I'm really interested to get like a broad range of perspectives here from where we all come from. And Mel, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to start with you, really. And so when we're thinking about the lifetime skills guarantee, and we're thinking about some of the recommendations that you've outlined, what would you say, like if the government were going to help us change one thing, what would that one thing be that would have the biggest impact for people developing skills?
So I think if I had to choose, it's got to be reviewing eligibility for the lifetime skills guarantee. Yeah. Because part of that is about it's about really targeting that scheme to the people that could benefit from it most. And I think reviewing the eligibility criteria to make sure that people who perhaps maybe already hold a level 3 qualification but are in lower paid, more junior roles, targeting that funding towards them as well as people who don't yet hold a level 3 could really unlock significant opportunities for people over the year ahead.
Because you can kind of understand, well, I don't want people who have tons of opportunity already availing themselves of this budget, but I think in setting the limit where they've set it, it can mean that those that are really in need of that support don't get it. And I think that's a critical one. Like when we think about the number of people in the workforce that haven't had any training at all since they left school, and it very well may be that they happen to have a level 3 qualification, it seems a misguided policy when you kind of think, you know, maybe it's a good thing that some people can't avail of the budget, but it seems to be missing the mark significantly, doesn't it?
Quite. I mean, I think just alluding to a point you made during your presentation, we know that 80% of the workforce, the 2030 workforce, are working now. So lifelong learning throughout our working lives is going to be increasingly important. So it's not right, really, as you say, that somebody who took part in a single A-level or a single qualification at level 3 15, 20 years ago should have that sole qualification as their only opportunity for learning throughout their working life. Yeah. And the other thing is that our analysis found that people, at the moment, the majority of training is going to people that already hold qualifications. So the system as it stands is favouring people who left school with a suite of A-levels, who perhaps then completed higher or further education straight afterwards. The more qualifications you have, the more training you get access to. So rather than kind of allowing people to game the system, I think changing the eligibility criteria could actually make it better target people who would need it most.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I guess let's assume we're in the utopia where we do get those things changed and people have the ability to develop themselves. James, if I kick this one over to you, and maybe we go around the room, like what skill areas do you think that businesses should be focused on and developing in particular? Is there anything that immediately springs to mind?
Thanks, Joe. I mean, that's the several billion-dollar question, I guess, isn't it, really? And from where we're sat, I think I'd probably highlight two that jump out at me, and they both flow that something came from your presentation, which is the pandemic has actually exacerbated problems that are already there. I don't think it's created a huge amount of new ones. And one of the things that we saw very much was a failure of the skills system to keep up with digital skills that were incredibly important 2 years ago and are now absolutely essential, as your team found out as I tried to connect my laptop to your web platform for about 20 minutes. And they did very well not to swear at me. I'm very impressed, which brings us to the second one as well, actually, which is there's a bit of a gap sometimes in terms of soft skills and essentially kind of being businesslike, particularly in the younger cadre. So those people who are entering now who would still be in the workforce in 2040, which I don't think will include me. I'm quite happy about, actually, but who knows with the way the pension's going. And I think that brings us to a policy point around the guarantee, which is you're applying a qualification filter. But actually what we're saying is that the lack of qualifications is not the gap. It's the lack of social skills and the lack of modern skills. And so actually they're applying the wrong filter to get the right people into this accelerated cadre. So I think that really does highlight the need to have another look at the LSG. And actually I took the liberty of speaking to DFE yesterday, and Stoll was inspired by some of the workforce work, and they are open to thinking about how it's structured. So it's a really good time to contribute that into the media.
Excellent. No, that's great insight. Thank you, James. And Victoria, I wonder if I could bring you in as well at this point, obviously speaking from like real life experience, and for you guys at BP, what are the skill areas that you're focused on right now? What's important as you think about the future of your business?
Well, I'd echo what was just said, actually. I think from our side, those digital skills, the skills that actually we still really don't know what we need, so what those roles are as yet. And we're still, you know, the speed of what digital skills is moving at, we see that become more and more important to us, but also those soft skills. And I'll come on and talk a bit more about some of the work that we've been doing around upskilling early careers and people throughout their career to help them get those soft skills. And so the only piece that I would probably add to this is around agile and agility. So we're seeing as well very much in our workforce of being people coming in and not always working on the same project day in and day out, but almost creating these groups where we need to be agile in the way that we work and work really quickly and then bring people out of that project and move into another. So that is another skill that we see us investing in heavily as we go into 2021 and beyond.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to note. I think we mentioned a little bit earlier that the current pandemic, it kind of accelerates underlying trends. And in that acceleration, that need for change and the need for people who work in our organizations to be comfortable and capable of that change. I think gone are the roles where you're employed for a function that exists for a period of decades that doesn't really exist anymore. Are you seeing that accelerate through the pandemic, or is it carrying on at the same pace that it was before? How is that manifesting?
From our perspective at BP, you'd be aware that we're reinventing our organisation, and we have a new chief exec that actually started in early this year. And I would say we were already on that journey. The pandemic has probably sped it up somewhat, but it was already something that was on our minds. So we're kind of a bit ahead of the curve on this one, to be honest.
Yeah, right.
I would say it has sped up somewhat because of the pandemic.
Fantastic. And then Mel, like obviously through the research that your organization is doing, is there anything that's coming out of that around the skills that businesses should be developing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we conducted a literature review at the start of this research, and then, as I mentioned, engaged with subject experts and with employers. And to echo those points, we know digital just kept coming up. And to kind of borrow the wording used by one of the stakeholders we engaged with, she compared digital to literacy. She said, you know, we learn to read once, and then we know how to read. It's once and it's done. And yes, we practice, we keep up, whether it's for work or leisure, and we keep our reading skills going, but you don't really need to go back and learn again. Digital is the opposite of that, but we're sort of still treating it as though it is,
Right.
you know, as though it isn't. You know, we're doing a training course once and then it's off you go. And all of us are adapting, whether it's Teams or Zoom and collaborative platforms, whether it's other forms of remote working. We're constantly adapting to digital, and we'll need to keep on nurturing our digital skills throughout our working lives. It would be bizarre to think after COVID, after we've all finally got the hang of webinar platforms or whatever else, we'll be thought and we'll be digital, you know, digitally savvy. That's not going to be the case. So I think, yes, absolutely, digital is a priority, and kind of embedding ongoing opportunities to build digital skills will be really important.
Yeah.
And then just building on that point about soft skills, absolutely, what kept coming up for us was line management. You know, very often people become line managers by accident, and then sort of learning as they go. What we know works well is kind of supporting people to develop those soft skills as managers through a combination of, you know, whether it's mentoring or formal training. But of course, that also then feeds into the wider points from our presentations about access to learning and development opportunities. Managers who are really invested in their teams are more likely to be kind of thinking, okay, let's have a conversation about your long-term professional development. So I think investing in your managers can pay dividends as part of that kind of wider investment in talent management.
Yeah, I think there's some really good points in there, particularly digital. As we think about this, of course, it's part of our lives. And through the pandemic, even to the point where my kids are mortified that they see me on House Party. You know, I've worked this stuff out now. You can't hide from me anymore. And so if we take that from that aspirational point of like, what do we want to focus on? James, what are you seeing in your role in terms of like how businesses have approached kind of skills development in the recent past? What's actually happening today?
That's a really good question, and I think the pandemic is driving a lot of that shift, and you know, I suppose I would characterize the early days of it, certainly the first national lockdown, as, my God, how do we survive? And everything that wasn't absolutely core to that was very much put on the back burner. And one can understand that. You know, we were tracking businesses and we were just watching them by their thousands, the cash flow reduce to the point where we had, the majority had less than a week's worth of available cash. And at that point, you're talking about your children's future. You're less worried about the workforce of 2030, and that's perfectly natural. And I think that started to rebound a little bit, and there have been some shifts which have helped that. So really important was the move to allow training on furlough, and that should continue with the job support scheme. But if that's not there, that's not there. So there's been that contraction, and then there's been that nervousness and that need to try and give people enough digital skills to be able to operate from home when they hadn't in the past. So, you know, how do you set up the laptop? How do you Zoom, etc., etc.? How do you operate? But I think we're at a crunch point now where a lot of that's there, and the question is, what is the new normal, and what is our medium-term ambition to get through it, and how much do we need to support our people, and what does that look like? And I'm not certain a lot of businesses have answered that, to be honest with you, and I'm not certain that the training system has developed to a point where it's helping them to answer it. One of the things we say, and I've found shocking in this role actually, is the weakness of the employer voice, particularly SMEs, so pretty chunky organizations with say 200 people working there, but how weak their voice is in that development skills system. It's almost run with them as passengers rather than drivers, and I think that's something that needs to shift. And I would look to the white paper on FE reform when that comes out, where you may see a significant shift there. So to summarize, initially a big contraction, then stabilizing. Now they're thinking about the medium term, but I think there does need to be a parallel shift in the delivery structure so that it makes that work. But it covers a multitude of different companies with different experiences.
Yeah, and I guess that's a great segue to kind of think about companies who are tackling this in innovative ways. Vic, you mentioned earlier that There's some work that you guys are doing at BP focusing on like upskill and particularly the entry-level new starters that you're taking on at the moment. Do you want to talk to us a little bit more about what's happening there?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's two key initiatives that BP have run this year to help build the skills of the future and kind of to help make them accessible to all. The first one is BP Boost, which is UK specific, and the second has been our Global Skills Accelerator. So just tell you a little bit about both of those. The BP Boost came out really because of the pandemic, and we've always wanted to do something on the virtual space, and this was an opportunity to really push ourselves to get it done very, very quickly. And it's a series of virtual events for UK students, which had the objective of providing students with skills and insights that will benefit them for their early stages of their career. And this had a focus on D&I. So our students were really drawn to these opportunities. And I think it's because of the pandemic, but also the future uncertainty that we have. But it was also an opportunity for us to give something back to our diversity partners that we work with, to kind of inspire students during this period of uncertainty. So as I said, it was virtual events that we've run with inspirational external speakers as well as BP experts. The events were all free and open to all students, and we wanted to be as inclusive as possible, to be honest. And the first session that we did was in August, and we ran a couple more in October, focusing on empowering women and then around social mobility. And actually, we've found by running these events virtually that we've been able to reach the highest number of diverse students that we've able to engage with since we began hosting targeted upskilling events around diversity and inclusion. And I think we'll see more and more of this, not only from ourselves but from others, because it really does give you the opportunity, because of the accessibility, to be a lot more inclusive in the way that we attract and we engage with students. But on top of that, we've also continued to evolve our award-winning skills initiative, which some people may be aware of, called the Skills Refinery. This was created based on the skills needed by the future workforce, as outlined by the World Economic Forum. And the changing landscape that we're seeing at the moment sees that those, as we've all said today, actually, those transferable skills are really important. And we know that soft skills are becoming more of a marker of work readiness for employability, but also not only at entry level, but at all levels in the organisation, again, as we talked about today. So after 2 years of the Skills Refinery, we felt we needed to evolve the initiative and keep it relevant. And as the Skills Refinery only focused on early careers, we wanted to make sure it was relevant for all stages of people at their career, especially during the pandemic. And actually yesterday it launched, which is the Skills Accelerator. And the idea here is trying to kind of help participants understand the value that each of the skills that we were presenting, how it can help them in their future. And it was, again, as was with BP Boost, it's a free to access virtual skills session, this time run by BP experts, kind of to help us fulfill our mission of unlocking those skills. And I'm mindful of time, but so I won't go into too much detail, but there were 5 skills that were based around leveraging change, learning to unlearn, resilience, all of those, and acute emotional intelligence, all that are really important throughout your career, especially in the time that we find ourselves in. And then with that nod around digital, around partnering with artificial intelligence and understanding how you work collaboratively and with AI. So we had our first session yesterday, as I said, with over 300 participants. So it started really well, and it gives us, again, that opportunity to reach a global audience and a very diverse audience, and provide skills to people who may not have access to it. So I'll stop there, but if anyone wants to know more, drop me a note on LinkedIn.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant, Victoria. It sounds like you guys are hitting a lot of the points that have come up through the work that we've done and we've showcased today. I'd be interested, clearly at BP, you've got a particular set of resources and time to be able to go and think about this. If you were giving advice to a smaller company, and by small, we're talking about the SMMAs you were talking about a second ago, James, 200 employees and what have you, that are kind of balancing time and productivity and learning based on the feedback that you're getting? What advice might you give smaller companies that are trying to kind of weigh up, if they should invest time here or not?
For sure, and I think that's a great question. And I think although BP is a large organisation, there's not a big team trying to do this behind the scenes. And I think for us, helping give those skills to the future is really important in a way that the benefit is for everybody else and all other organisations. So it doesn't have to be time consuming. We're recording all of these sessions, so they'll be out there, but either partner with each other, or for my side, focus on one or two of those skills. We talked about whether it's digital or whether it's one or two soft skills. They're relevant to their business and really help and engage with those students in the areas that they can. I mean, I think we're really fortunate now having virtual platforms that make it a lot easier. You don't have to invest the time of physically running these events or going out. You can do it all online, use social to market it and run it through those virtual events. But partner with other organisations, talk to your network, and that will really help you get it off the ground.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. And then Mel, thinking about just in general what businesses should take away when it comes to skills and supporting their workforce, what would be your advice there?
Well, crucially, I'd say it's really important, kind of thinking back to that point about who's getting access to training and who isn't. It's so important that your whole workforce are having conversations about learning and development opportunities, whatever role. And I think too often, inadvertently, for some workers, those conversations aren't happening, perhaps because there's an assumption in some places that the training available might not be of interest, or that because we know that those workers have other personal responsibilities, they might not be interested in taking training up. So I think the starting point is make sure that everybody is having those conversations about learning and development. And then I think building on some of the points that Vicky's made, I think engage with organisations in your local community. So there will be training provided local to you that will want to make sure that the training that they're offering is meeting local needs. So there's a role that you could play in kind of steering discussions about skills, whether it's with colleges and FE providers, whether it's with your local enterprise partnership or a sector body at a local level. There is kind of strategic discussions at that level you could be involved in. And then as James has mentioned, there is, the government is in listening mode at the moment on skills. I think there is an increasing awareness that so much about the skills system isn't quite meeting employer needs or learners' needs, really. And they're receptive to ideas about changing that. So there's a consultation going on at the moment around training at level 2. There's a further education white paper coming later, over the months ahead, and there'll be some further engagement around the skills guarantee itself. So there is an opportunity here for employers to, as James has referenced, really have their voices heard, because in some cases those voices have been missing in those discussions.
And I think particularly those SMEs, there are a lot of them and they make up such a large portion of the market, but perhaps it's a fragmented voice. So I guess that nicely segues into you, James. What do you think businesses should take away from today thinking about supporting their teams?
Yeah, of course. And the idea of coming together is a really important one. And I think businesses will increasingly see the enlightened part of enlightened self-interest. So we all come together, we all do better, rather than compete on the bits they need to compete on, price and product. And he says trying to reach back to his GCSE marketing business studies course. I'm going to slightly squirrel the conversation, I'm afraid, John, which is a bit cheeky. But I think out of all of these crises, and this is easy for me to say, but innovation will determine which companies survive and prosper and which don't. And that's if you look at the Totaljobs example, being innovative is what's kept you ahead of the market thinking about these kind of things, partnering with people like the Work Foundation, has kept you ahead of the curve because you're unafraid to try new things and test them and refine them. And I think there's something in childcare. We look at the 2008-9 recession. What we actually saw was women did proportionately worse out of the recovery than men. It's a bit difficult to understand why, but it looks a lot like because childcare wasn't fully taken account of, and I'm afraid to say women tend to have more childcare responsibilities than men. So what we're saying there in economic terms is you have a piece of the supply side of the economy that most companies aren't getting to because they don't understand their needs, or they try and cater for them in a traditional way. And so you're missing a lot of underpriced talent because you can't think in terms of the whole package. And it is not women or men, let's say it's childcare, but there is something there. And this is not just the UK. When the OECD look across these kind of studies, they find that in almost all European countries, most companies will miss the importance of childcare in terms of skills development and in terms of attracting people in. I think those companies that can think a little bit more about what that huge part of their workforce who have a life, who have 2 kids, and I'm worried that my 5-year-old's going to come screaming in at any point and say hello. And she does. She's very lovely. She's very erudite. You know, much better than me. But I think there is a huge amount there. If you can design your development, your training, and actually your attraction packages for people who have a life outside of work, then you will do, I suspect, considerably better than people who don't do it. And it shouldn't be that difficult because I suspect all of us know somebody who've had kids at one point, even if it's just our parents. So it just takes that little bit of time out and thought. And I'm now really worried that either Olivia or Henry's going to...
No, you said it.
I'm very sorry. Oh, there we go. Yes,
listen, I think that is an excellent point to land it on. And when we think about digital, we think about soft skills, and we think about flexibility. These are things, muscles, if you like, that we've all had to develop over the last 6-9 months. And I think understanding that strengths in those areas equal strengths everywhere across your business, not just purely in the ability to do something, I think speaks to me quite a lot from having this conversation with you all. So thank you so much, Mel. Thank you, James. Thank you, Victoria. I appreciate you taking the time out to walk through this information with us. If anybody watching the call wants to keep track of the progress, or you want to follow up on some of the things that we're doing, we're going to send an email after this that'll include a link to the webinar, the slides, some policy updates, etc. So you'll have all of that information. Clearly, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn to any of our panelists today around any of the information that you've heard from. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. So thank you very much, guys. Appreciate it.